Yes.
Okay.
So
Well,
just close the door.
To quote Monty Python, and now for something completely different, we are going to attempt a trialogue, to reflect together about the experience of being chaplains in a university, and particularly using the article by Sam Spears, which you may or may not have read, but you have copies of it if you'd like to read it later. We're each going to take about 10 minutes and put out some ideas, make some remarks, and then we'll maybe interact with each other and then open it up for interaction with everyone. That's the plan. I wanted to begin my remarks by saying, making a few observations about the history of the institution that I serve, Northwestern University. Northwestern University was founded on May 31st, 1850. On May 31st, 1850, 9, and this is important, Chicago businessmen and clergy gathered in a hardware store, above a hardware store in Chicago, to plan the creation of a university that would serve the Northwest Territories. People often wonder why we're called Northwestern when we're in the middle of the country. We're not in Washington State or somewhere. But at the time, that's as far as the country extended, and we were the Northwest Territory. The folks who gathered there was this, why that's important, I think, is that there was a kind of bringing together of the sacred and the secular, the businessmen and the clergy. They were not two separate ideas. They saw them as related, very closely related. There's a history of the creation of many universities in the mid-19th century by George Marsden called The Soul of the American University. I'm not sure I agree with all of his conclusions, but his account of that history is worth reading if you are interested. The folks who founded Northwestern, I think, could be described as progressive evangelicals. They were devout Methodists, but they weren't so concerned about doctrines and they were about the business of making the world better. And that's the kind of thing that they were devoted to. One of the important figures in our history is someone named Frances Willard. Frances Willard is best known probably today for founding the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The headquarters is just down the street from the chapel where I work. And many people think of her as someone who was just devoted to spoiling the fun of fraternity boys by eliminating alcohol. But in reality, she was a progressive social reformer, but also an evangelical Christian. It's an interesting combination. She promoted prison reform. She was interested in the rights of women, and she was very progressive in many ways. She was probably one of the best known people in the 19th century in the United States. She was the head of something called the Northwestern Female College, which became part of Northwestern, and she became dean of students of that school within the university. So we claim her as our own. Fast forward a bit to 1963. It wasn't until 1963, 113 years after the founding, that the university was given a gift to build a chapel. And so the Alice Millar Chapel was dedicated in the fall of 1963. And what's interesting about that, one thing that's interesting about that is the stained glass windows in our chapel. Our chapel is not as big or impressive as Duke Chapel, but we have better stained glass. And we have 10 windows on the side the side windows in the chapel, each of them depicting an endeavor of the university. So there's a law window, a medicine window, a science window, humanities, literature and the arts, music, commerce and industry. There's one called, what is it? It's basically political science. And they have all these images in there that reflect these worldly endeavors. I'm sorry?
I was teasing. I said, ours reflect God.
So,
I was teasing. I was teasing.
The front window in the chancel window, which is very large, depicts biblical theology. And so the idea is that all these various disciplines are brought together in a sacred space, so that it's not an escape from the world, but the world is there. And we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses, but it's also focused on the world and God. It's complicated. I'll tell you more about our windows later. Anyway, in 1974, so 1963, we get a chapel for the very first time. In 1974, the university petitioned and petitioned the state legislature to revise the charter to separate Northwestern from the Methodist Church.
For what?
To separate the university from the Methodist Church. So up until that time, the relationship had become very tenuous, but always one member of the Board of Trustees had to be, usually it was the Methodist bishop, who was the chair of the Board of Trustees. And that was changed so that we no longer had any official ties to the Methodist Church. And from that point on, we saw ourselves as a completely secular university without the burden of this connection. So, what does that mean? You might know the name William Sloane Coffin. He was the chaplain at Yale University in the 1960s. And he once said, and I think this might have been at Alison's installation at University of Chicago, Coffin said, I think it was there, and I think I have this right, the university and the church used to be married. Now they are divorced. The university claimed mental cruelty.
Wow.
He meant it as a joke, but not a joke. And I think he went on to say, though, that there was a possibility of reconciliation. Alison may remember that better than I do. Well, that's one account that the religion and the university went separate directions. But also, one time I had a group of Methodist clergy visiting the campus, and they wanted to see the chapel, and I was showing them around. And one of them said, "How did we lose Northwestern?" And my somewhat flippant response was, I think this line comes from All the President's Men, follow the money. Northwestern is currently a $2 billion a year corporation, not-for-profit corporation, $2 billion. Where does the money come from? Not the Methodist Church, that's for sure. I mean, it would be impossible for any denomination to really support what's happening. Well, it comes from government and private grants and sponsored projects. Tuition is a fraction of what pays for the university, but there's all this research. And so, rather than being accountable to religious authorities, we're now accountable to these financial people who are giving the money. And so I think it's a complicated history, and one that and so there's a temptation, like my Methodist friend who asked, how did we lose Northwestern, to long for the good old days when we were together. Let's go, how do we get back to that? I'm not sure we can go back. I wanted to say a couple of things about the sort of awkwardness between the university, within the university, the awkwardness of talking about religion and practicing religion. And just a couple of examples. Several years ago, there was a program at Northwestern on religion and journalism, helping journalists understand how to cover religion, which is a great program. They did a conference, and it happened to be in our building, and they were, how do journalists cover religion in higher education? And so they put together a panel of students. And I remember one of the students said, went on at great length about her involvement in her religious community in high school. And she had gone to Washington, D.C. for a summer program, and she talked about how great that was. There were young people from all over the country coming together, and they learned so much, and it was just amazing. And one of the journalists who was attending said, so what's your experience been on campus? And she said, I don't do anything. It's just not done here. Which, they had to talk me off a ledge, because I was like, oh no, I have failed. But there's a sense in which there's social pressure not to be involved in religious life. I was talking to a Lutheran campus pastor on our campus, and he said that he had been talking to some students and thought maybe they would have their services, their Sunday services later in the day. They might get more people to come. Their services at 10:30 on Sunday morning. And one of the students says, oh, please don't change that. Don't change the time. And he said, well, why not? And he said, the student said, because I can slip out of the residence hall early in the morning and no one knows that I'm going to church. This is a person who's committed to participation in that community. And yet...
And why is that?
Because of the social pressure. It's
yes,
not,
but why the social pressure?
I think that for a number of students, my next point. What we have seen over the past decade or more, actually more, we've been talking about this a long time, is the growth of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S.
Yeah.
These folks who are not affiliated with a religious tradition. And I think there are a lot of reasons. That there's not one reason why a person
Is a nun.
is a nun. The phrase that I hear all the time, and I'm sure others hear this too, is I'm spiritual but I'm not religious.
Okay.
And the temptation is to dismiss those folks and say, they're narcissistic, they're self-absorbed, and to sort of blame them for where they are. And for me, it's important that we listen to them and to try to discover why they're reluctant to identify with a religious tradition. I do a lot of weddings, and I meet with couples, and we plan the ceremony. One time I was, and I hear this all the time from couples. Usually they're alumni who've been out for a few years. And so this couple said, well, we're spiritual but not religious. I said, well, tell me about that. And he said, my brother was abused by a clergy person, and I'll never go into a church. I'll never go into that church again. And they were getting married in a chapel. So I think there are a lot of reasons, and we could maybe talk about some of those reasons later.
They are so strong to put social pressure against people that practice religion.
That's right. One of the things that we also observe on our campus is religious illiteracy. People don't know very much. Even people who are involved, very strongly involved in a religious tradition, don't often know. I give a religious literacy quiz to my class every year that I got from Stephen Prothero at Boston University. And, we have students who, one of the questions is name as many of the 10 Commandments as you can. And the average is, people can name about 4, which is, to me, it's kind of astonishing.
Just curiously, which 4?
It varies. It varies. One of the, how am I doing on time? Am I over?
It's fine.
Are you sure? Okay.
It's fine.
I'll just say, one of the things that occurs to me, and I just want to put this comment out, I think that it's important for us not to offer an easy on-ramp to religious traditions. Because it's tempting to do that. Oh, come, join us. We're, and
4 commandments are enough.
4 commandments are fine. It's above average. And I often tell students that becoming religious is like learning to play the violin. You cannot buy a cheap violin and announce that you are a violinist. The result of that is excruciating noise. And you have to get a teacher, and you have to practice, and you have to be diligent, and it takes a lot of time to get to the point where you either say to yourself or someone says to you, you are a violinist. And it seems to me that that's something that at least I try to say to students.
And they're interested in becoming violinists?
No, they're not. Some are. I think some are. But what is the path? I'm way over time. What I do hope we can come back to talk about is the distinction in the Sam Spears article about secularist and secular that he gets from Jeffrey Stout and others. I think that's an important distinction. But I will.
Does Alison want to talk next?
Would you want to go next, Alison, or Vrajvihari? Or?
I'm happy to go next, unless Vrajvihari would like to.
You go ahead.
Go ahead, just go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll follow Tim in my telling, and by telling you a little bit about Princeton University setting. Princeton was founded in 1746 by Presbyterians. Back in the colonies of the United States, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had Harvard, that was founded by Congregationalists. Later we went taken over by Unitarians. The Rhode Island colony had Brown, and that was Baptist. Yale was in Connecticut, and that was Congregationalist. Had in Philadelphia, and so the Presbyterians staked a claim to New Jersey with a what they called the College of New Jersey. It's now Princeton. New Light Presbyterian movement. They were trying to be what today we would call progressive within the Presbyterian movement. They were very, and they were at their time, very open-minded about Presbyterian. Also permitted Episcopalians to attend college. Presbyterian at that kind of time as one that prefigured today's situation in the university is vastly open to people from all religious perspectives. And it was led by presidents who were Presbyterian ministers until we had our president Woodrow Wilson. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, but he was the first, and there's never been any since, who Presbyterian minister to serve as president. And as I said when I biographical notes for the meeting, I passion letting go gradually over time of the Presbyterian. Called the churchiest of the Ivies. They mean that as really the most religious of 8 Ivy League institutions. And that's true. In a wonderful way, it is a place where religious practice is very much accepted within the student body. We gave up some mandatory chapel attendance in 1962, which is really quite late. As you heard from Tim, I used to serve at the University of Chicago, which built a massive, beautiful chapel between 1925 and 1928, big enough to fit the whole student body, but during 1926, eliminated mandatory chapel. So now all the students didn't have to go, and they didn't. Still have that big, wonderful chapel anyway. At Princeton, they only let go of that in 1962. Chapel was not just for Christian students. At the turn of the 20th century, they founded the Student Hebrew Society, and Jewish students were mandated to go to Jewish services on campus. So you couldn't get away from it even if you weren't Presbyterian or Christian. Today, we have students who are very, very actively engaged in religious communities. I would say the culture is very different from what you just heard described at Northwestern. If anything, the most visible student Christian organizations are quite theologically conservative. They are not the largest groups, but they have the biggest visibility on campus. So our students, whatever their religious background, mostly feel very, very encouraged to practice their faith and practice it quite openly. Some of them are very proud to be heading off to religious services on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, and whenever is appropriate for them. I think that there is a real disjuncture between when students are relating to they are in the classroom. And I've had students of faith tell me that in the classroom, they are more hesitant to let their peers know, certainly to let their faculty know that they are persons of faith. I think they worry about being seen as less intellectually capable. So I would say at my institution, there is culturally a real split between dialogue within the classroom and dialogue outside of the classroom. I also know some faculty who are absolutely fine letting it be known that they practice a particular faith. There are others who actually don't want that to be known. Again, they worry a bit about intellectual credibility from their peers, which is too bad, and something that my colleagues in my office are working against a lot. We think while we believe, and we believe while we think, is how we put it to ourselves and to others who will listen to us. And we are working always to present a model of intellectual people who do not, who do not have to split when we are in our academic lives. We are also people of faith all the time. The question of secularism is a real one on our campus. Actually, I just reminded myself of a conversation that the president of Princeton was telling me about a couple of years ago. He was walking across campus with another faculty member, and both of them are secular Jews. And they were talking about a student that they both know. And the student they both were agreeing was just particularly brilliant. And the faculty member said to the president, you know, the only thing that would really make her a better student is if she could get over her Judaism. which was appalling to the president for all the right reasons. And he shared that comment with me to lament with me that there are genuine opinions within our faculty that religious faith of any kind can impede the intellectual endeavor that we are, primarily about as an academic institution. Of mine at Princeton, but in general, at least in the sort of the academic culture that I've been marinated in for 27 years now in chaplaincies, is the idea that what is the equation of the idea of secular with neutral. So what is secular is what is neutral, and what is not secular, certainly what is spiritual, religious, has to be biased, is colored by ideas that are always going to leave one incapable of a kind of neutrality. And neutrality, of course, is where pure thinking happens. We are all trying to escape the trappings that would box our thinking into something that is, I'm going to use a religious term, I don't mean it that way though, parochial, that is particular, that is not capacious and spacious in its thinking, that is only ever going to be limiting. And my beef with all of that is that, of course, whatever one understands to be secular is just as conditioned by histories of thinking. We all have beliefs, whether we understand them to be in a secular key, a spiritual one, or a religious one. Some of us, and I would include myself, are putting together those three all the time. So I'm speaking out of a frustration that I feel in my own context, where I and people like me are said to have biases in ways that people who don't claim to, I guess I would say that those of us who are people of faith are simply ones who wear those biases on our sleeves, and who are more ready to talk about meaning making, where our beliefs come from, what their source is, what their goals are. The equation of secular with neutral is something that bothers me in my own context. Why don't I stop there and give Brahmachari a chance to talk, and then we can open the conversation if that sounds okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alison. You sound amazingly coherent for 4 o'clock in the morning over there. That's great. Georgetown is a different little monster. Perched up there on the hill above Washington, D.C., it is nevertheless affected by what happens down in the swamp, so to speak. Georgetown, as some of you may know, being in Washington, D.C., is a Jesuit Catholic university of the Jesuit order founded by Bishop John Carroll in 1784, making it the oldest Catholic university in the United States of America. At that time, the Jesuits were being persecuted, and so enshrined in the charter of the university is a statement that goes for the spiritual edification of those of all religious professions. So you might say, oh, well, that's wonderful. That's a great start for interfaith. It's wonderful. It accepts everybody in. You forget, obviously, that while the university uses that to be its slogan for its interfaith appeal, it's actually specifically limited to the various Christian denominations in its original writing. However, they are the first university to hire a rabbi. And when they did hire this rabbi, Rabbi Harold White was asked the president of the university, why do you want a rabbi? Because there are only a handful of Jewish students here at Georgetown. Why do you need a rabbi? And he says, well, I don't want you to be a rabbi for my Jewish students. I want you to be a rabbi for all my students. And that has kind of it's demonstrative of the kind of modus of Georgetown, which currently has it in the black books of conservative Catholics. Georgetown, therefore, is with an LGBTQ center, with a center for Jewish studies, with Casa Latina, with a center for African American studies, with now a Hindu monk, it definitely is on the peripheries of what conservative Catholics would consider Catholicism. But what the Jesuits at Georgetown argue is the heart of Catholicism. So it's a very big contrast, and to kind of play into what you were saying, on Dahlgren Chapel's windows are pictures of Jesuits. But anyway, getting into what I wanted to say, and I will limit myself, I hope, to these 10 minutes. Daijaku is my heroine. Thank you very much for verbalizing a lot of what is reflected in the historicity of Hindu relations with other religions. Thank you for that. I'm not going to try to condense what is 9,500 years of history into these 10 minutes, nor am I going to try to condense the 4 independent monotheist religious traditions that make up Hinduism into one Hinduism, and try to explain what that would look like for you to try and be a chaplain of Hindu students who are, I think by my last count, representing 80 different Hindu denominations. If you think that having a Methodist and a Lutheran service is challenging, try and figure out how that works for Hindus in this situation. What I do want to bring out from that, however, is the caveat that Hindus have in their faith life, and I'm speaking specifically as Hindu students' faith life in the United States of America. What most of us know about Hinduism comes through the scholarship of Hinduism. We know that most of the scholarship on Hinduism comes from the Royal Asiatic Society, founded in the 1700s by Sir William Jones, very specific, Church of England. He had a view for why he wanted to found the Royal Asiatic Society. He actually wanted to learn from the cultures that were there. However, his successors followed a line of thought that was which was well articulated by Lord Macaulay. Lord Macaulay basically said that if you destroy the education of Hindus, you will enable them to become Christian. And that was his ethos, that was his goal in his stewardship of his time as head of the British Empire. So he very systematically went through and defunded all of these things, and you get where I'm going with that. Let's not dwell on the past too much. Let me instead turn to the worldview that causes a little bit of a difference when you're not competing with people, when you're in the same place where people say you must choose or suffer. And we are asking you to choose not out of a place of condemnation, but out of a place of mercy, or out of a place of genuine love. The Hindu caveat is that we do not necessarily think that the student life period is a time when you need to find religion, or you need to be asking spiritual questions. For us, the studentship period is a period when you're focused solely on study, and you are learning from experts. After that, when you're entering into the married life, then you're sort of picking up on your duty to society, and then finally you move into this stage after your kids have had grandchildren, have given you grandchildren rather, that you now start to pick up on these spiritual questions. So the whole premise is different. The whole premise of having a Hindu chaplain, the Hindu chaplain's at least view of how he should be dealing with his Hindu students, is completely different to how, say, Chi Alpha would be dealing with the students in Chi Alpha. Right? That obviously doesn't work well for university metrics. For the metrics for those people who are assessing whether having continued chaplaincies at a United States leading institution, as they like to call themselves, especially for an institution who is creating all of the people who are staffing the FBI building, all of the people who are staffing the United States Senate's building, the White House, etc., the Foreign Service, obviously, if you come to Georgetown, you're getting into the Foreign Service. They're trying to see how they can justify having religion, and when religion cannot give them any metrics that are measurable, obviously, for business managers, then it's going to be very difficult to convince them to continue on with this journey. Coming back to the Hindus. I specifically put around this article by Professor Rambachan, who is at St. Olave's College. He's currently in the Vatican at the moment on a Hindu conference with the Catholic Church. I put it around because it was a response to the recent Pew Research Center findings on the religious kind of landscape of America in 2015, where he said that the nuns in the country were now 65%. And that for Hindus specifically, it was no longer a choice between remaining Hindu or changing to a different religion, but now the choice for students was remain Hindu or get rid of religion altogether. And that to me is more alarming than a Hindu changing their religion. Why is that the case for Hinduism? Well, Hindus just turn around and they look to the past because we are a people who are tied to our culture, and our cultural memory still lives with us. We turn back and we look at the Jesuit institution that we're in, and we are cognizant of the fact that it was founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola in the 1500s, whose godbrother was St. Francis Xavier, who when he went to India and then on to China and Japan, did not find success at baptizing large swathes of people as he expected to, came back and wrote the King of Portugal a letter demanding of him that as he was the king of a Catholic country with territories in India, that it was his Catholic duty to institute an inquisition. That inquisition, whose records up to the 1700s were burned before the Portuguese gave over to the British, those records detail in kind of appalling clarity how St. Francis was appalled by Hindus. He demanded that priests be beheaded. He demanded that temples be demolished. 300 temples in Goa, very ancient temples in Goa, were demolished. And I was joking to my Jesuit compadre at the Jesuit Heritage Week that, if St. Francis Xavier and the Jesuit vision of St. Francis was true, I would be sitting here without my head. And it was only then that he understood the difference in our cultural history. It has not been the same. So the students will see that. And they will remember that Xavier wrote to the king. Why the king? Because the king had the power to enforce. Where is the power now? The power is in money. And they will turn to the present and look at what's happening in India, with certain groups in the United States sending yearly $384 million solely for the purposes of conversion. And they will hear this $384 million and they will ask, well, where is it? There is nothing that says they're going there to convert. The Hindus themselves will pick up the newspapers and read, and they will go and investigate, and they'll find actually that they're operating as NGOs because they want to make the world a better place. Where making the world a better place means making the world a Christian better place. So they look at these two big sources of cultural history with the people that they're interacting with, and they say, well, if Hinduism is not giving me the answers I want, and I look to the other religion that's near me, which is well-funded, which has this beautiful university, so surely that religion must have something going for it that has allowed it to get to where it is. They then turn around and say, well, look at what they've done to us, look at what they're doing to us. They don't distinguish between different Christian groups, just as other people do not distinguish between the various groups of Hindus that they belong to. And they say, well, look at these Christians, what they do to us, sod the Christians, sod the Hindus, forget religion.
It happens?
100%. This is a very, very rapidly increasing trend. And this is why I think it's so important to understand the contours of the student experience that Spears is outlining. The students, and I think this holds true, there's a statement in the Bhagavad Gita that it's out of a million people that 2 people would decide to engage on a spiritual journey. And out of those 2 people, it will be very rare for any one of them to find perfection on their spiritual journey. And this holds true, as I said, for Hindu students on a campus. Those who have a spiritual spark, the majority being not interested in religion anymore, those who have a spiritual spark will do what I call self-medication. They will take what they want and try to treat their existential problems, their psychological problems with whatever they find on the shelf. But I use that example with a specific goal in mind, because you can treat you can treat a headache, or you can treat feelings of dizziness as you wish, but it would take a doctor to notice and connect these symptoms and say, well, actually, you've got a problem with your blood pressure. And this is what I would like to propose, bringing my 10 minutes, coming up to 10 minutes now. For the majority of Hindus, the connections on the Hindu side, so I've outlined the problems for the other host community. For the Hindu side, they look to India and they see the nationalist government as representing Hinduism. And they will see that they're always ultra-conservative or right-wing. And they will view it as problematic. Moderate and liberal Hindus, however, don't get to say anything, those people who are on leaderships, because those who are in leadership and are Hindu, if they say anything that might be quite logical, but be in Hindu interests, they're immediately presumed to be aligning with the conservative Hindus. And so those students who are Hindu, who are moderate, who love being Hindu, they will eschew the label. They will say no. We are rational, logical beings. As Tim was saying, we're rational, logical beings. We do not need to be Hindu to be these rational, logical beings and be fulfilled. Yet they will quietly sneak into our weekly services on campus, and we still have a good 80 students turning up every Sunday, which is quite big. So what I'm trying to say, basically, I didn't mention this bit, and I think I should. They do love the practices. Not only do they love the practices, everybody loves the practices. You can do yoga in all different flavors, and this $2 billion enterprise that has come up would have people taking the revered ascetic practice of yoga, which has a good 3,500 year history on it, and have you doing downward dog yoga, having you doing beer yoga, having you do, what was the latest one I heard? Oh yeah, dog yoga, beer yoga, Coke yoga.
I've definitely heard
hot yoga, obviously.
Yoga for Yahweh.
Yoga for Yahweh. Oh wait, no, the best one that irked me while I was at Georgetown, this Ignatian University, was Ignatian yoga.
Wow.
So they do like the spiritual practices, but they cannot take those spiritual practices being lumped together with the tradition. And what I'm going to ask everybody is it a question of perception? And if it is a question of perception, we need to reorient ourselves a little bit. But again, with this yoga example, if we are promoting our practices in exclusion to the tradition, we will get these these dog yoga people. We will get these sex gurus. This is what happens when you disassociate those practices from their tradition. And so I do think that we need to look at our language, and maybe interfaith can be the source of helping to rethink branding of our religions and our religious traditions and our practices as one facet of the overall push. Promoting practices, therefore, that are tethered to a religious tradition is the way to go, and underscoring the tether of those who inspire us to become part of a tradition is important. And I say that because a lot of us, and I was saying this to Megan, a lot of us encounter religion not through the philosophy. So we can be theologically and philosophically on the same page with regards to interfaith. But that's not how we got into our religion. As our friend, I forget his name, the gentleman was saying yesterday about his experiences in the jail because of the KGB. Thank you. It wasn't his Jewish teacher who taught him Judaism. It was the Book of Psalms that he had in his pocket. Right? It's not, it was not for me the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. No, it was going into a temple and feeling the spirituality of the temple. And so I hope that we can focus our efforts on highlighting some of these practices, seeing how they can be worded, seeing how they can be oriented for the 21st century without turning them into the dog yoga or the sex guru of kind of
But
lurid
in
memory.
one sentence,
Yeah.
it seems to me like like an oxymoron
Uh-huh.
to leave the doctrines aside and just the practice, and not to have dog yoga.
Well, so this is where I would say that we're not. There is a way of doing it that does not ask you to leave the doctrine. I was talking about front house and back house. So what is presented to people versus the people who are organizing everything being tied into something. And I would say that this is how the Jesuits are working. The Jesuit institution of Georgetown doesn't have to, in the words that it speaks to everybody. We're a university grounded in the Catholic and Jesuit institution, but we do not force Catholicism on anyone, and we do not ask that anybody engage with Catholicism. What they do, however, is they have a mission examen where a group of Jesuits go around to each of their Jesuit universities and sees how Jesuit ethoses are passed down through the university. And they ask that from hiring faculty, to hiring staff, to hiring administrators, are you hiring people who agree with the Jesuit values? In your classroom programming, has your syllabus got something that subconsciously will be, articulated, if articulated at all? Is it oriented to support the Jesuit values? Are the Jesuit values getting airtime, even though you're in the sciences, even though you are in, all the other policy areas that do not need to deal with religion and view religion as negative? And so this is how they do it. I'm not saying that that's how we do what we have, but I think that there's something to be learned. And that's where I'll stop.
This is the exact opposite to what these two Jewish professors said. She could be a wonderful student if she just abandoned the Jewishness.
Right.
Right. The exact opposite.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Alison.
Questions, comments?
Questions?
Smart relax. John?
I appreciate what you said about the Jesuit University. Marquette's the same way.
Mhm.
And it's always had sort of a big C Catholic and a little C Catholic.
Yeah.
And the little C Catholic is a broadly, richly humanist version of the big C Catholic. And over the years, the Jesuit presence has diminished. I suspect it has at Georgetown.
Yeah.
And the problem is there was a burden on the laity to take over that presence. And my impression, especially among the faculty, is there's often an unwillingness of people to witness to their own religious identity. I mean, I label myself a priest. I put my father when I go into all my name. It's listed on my department title. And I've always done that because I think it's important for, especially teaching philosophy, that students understand if there's a priest coming in to teach philosophy, because too many students think that if there's a priest teaching, it's going to be dogmatically oriented towards a particular tradition. And I'm not like that. But part of what I think I do in doing that is try to address the question that was raised earlier. It's important for me for my students to understand that there can be a priest from a tradition who's very wedded to that tradition, who in fact is not intellectually stunted in his own growth, but can, I think, work on equal ground with anybody in academia. And I think it's important for students to get that example. I think the Jesuits try to present that example. Some very conservative Catholics do, but it tends to be very dogmatic. But there's got to be this way of witnessing to our own religious identity in a classroom without having to proselytize people. And yet show them our own ways, how the intellectual and our own life of faith is integrated, because that's the best way to give models to our students. Yeah. And the other point is, I think we're in the seed planting business. My students that take philosophy don't know the difference between philosophy and astrology when they come, because it's not taught in school. Right. And on the metric side, we're into that. I won't say the word I'm thinking of, it's not ecclesiastic. The metrics are all when they graduate. Well, when they graduate, most of the students could care less about philosophy. They grump about this, they grump about that. But as you do alumni surveys, 5 year out, they begin to see some of the seeds. 10, 20 years out, the seeds that were planted in a philosophy class, the critical questions, the ethical questions, when the students start dealing with real life experience, the kinds of questions and approaches that they were given in a philosophy class suddenly start ringing in their ears. And we get feedback that they find that they deal with questions differently from their other people who have never had a philosophy class. And I'm wondering on the metric side whether alumni survey show that a lot of the students who may be nuns, if the seeds are planted in a way, at some point later in their life, and I really like what you said about the trajectory of religious development, at some point later in their own life, some of the seeds they got in college begin to play out. And it's that metric that really is far more important for what we do than the short-term metric of when students simply graduate from college and may have chucked all this stuff temporarily.
Definitely resonate with that.
I think that the basic problem, something that is really insoluble, is that we have cross purposes and we cannot bridge over them unless we abandon one aspect. One is preserving, like say, tradition. You want the people that were born to a tradition of thousands of years of Hinduism to continue to be Hindus. And Catholics want to convert them to Catholicism. We want Jews that were 5,000 years Jews, we want to go on being Jews. Catholics want to convert them, the Inquisition tried to. It cannot, I think that the idea of preserving religion around the ethnic identity cannot work together with interfaith, and because it always leads to strife and fight and if you say we keep the tradition, so what was our tradition? To fight and kill each other. This was the and the nuns, I want to add to what Father John said, that about the nuns present a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful challenge. They are nuns, and you can sow seeds of interfaith in their minds, and they can make a decision that is not built on their ethnic identity, but you can say that you are part of a whole, and then you can choose, and then you can. So of course, everything can disintegrate, and you can make dog yoga, but I think then you are not a violinist, and the dog yoga is not bad because it does not represent the 3,500 years of yoga, because it's bad because it's superficial. So once you realize that, I think you choose a way that can repair the problem. I think that preserving ethnic identities, I don't think it's going to work.
So just to your point very quickly, that's not what I was meaning by tradition. When I say tradition, I mean the teachings, teachings as rational groundings of the practices that are done. But just to your point, very, very quickly, the students at USC were invited to go to a Diwali service, and the person from India who was a student there was doing it. He was advertised, people saw his name, etc., and there were about 40 people there. The week after, he was on a panel.
Right.
And that panel was convened because he was there. There were 10,000 people signed up to go and see him, and most of them were not from the university.
Wonderful.
Why? Who was this person? Exactly the same person who led the Diwali service, but in this panel now, he was known as one of the creators of World of Warcraft. That ubiquitous game. Yeah. So when the Hindu students saw him, he's Bharadwaj Nandakumar at the USC. When the students saw him there, they were like, "Wait a minute, weren't you that guy that was leading the Diwali puja? That couldn't have been you." And he says, "Yeah." So how can you create World of Warcraft if you're a Hindu? And he said, "This is my job. This is what I do, and I think Hinduism made me successful." And just because I am successful doesn't mean I'm going to abandon Hinduism. So I think that is a way that I would like
Right.
to. That's the kind of underlining that I'm hoping for, that people do feel comfortable enough to say that. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Alison.
Yeah, I hope this is still on point, just, this will also be a short thing. But I remember Alison, Boden, and I think everybody was, kind of this idea of being religious and someone being not intellectual, and you have to kind of put aside, and if you're successful in the business world, in the secular world, that the kind of religion will fall back, because maybe you don't need it as much anymore, even though you definitely need it to be successful, so you don't forget who you are in your place. But Alison also talking about this idea that somehow the secular is neutral, and somehow that you can't think while also being faithful, and you have to kind of separate that in order to be successful in the academic setting. I just want to say that when I have these conversations about the secular being neutral, or that people who have kind of dogmatic beliefs are somehow limited or restricted, I just say to them kind of what Alison Boden said, which is that everybody has an agenda, everybody has their history of development of how their beliefs got to these beliefs, everybody has certain values that they value over other values. Every single person, secular setting, any setting, and what I just say is to actually turn it on its head, and I say, everybody has these values, but it's something that people who are in academia can understand, and say everybody's values, everybody has an agenda, everybody has certain beliefs. That's something that can be translated into a language that people in academia understand, or people who aren't religious, let's say, or kind of see religion as something that's biased to understand. But in addition to that, to even say, we acknowledge, I don't know if it's our biases, but we acknowledge our commitments and our faith commitments and our values and our ideas. We say these are our ideas and our values, as opposed to, let's say, other ideas and values. The people who say that secular or not religious or intellectual or whatever is neutral are not acknowledging their biases, are not acknowledging their values, are not acknowledging the fact they're coming from certain assumptions that they're working off of. And that is inherently more dangerous, and that is inherently more biased. And to say to them, that's the problem. I think that's something that they can understand. That not acknowledging it is actually more dangerous than saying, I'm coming from this belief and speaking from that point.
So
Tim wants
I think just quickly, I want to recommend again the Sam Spears article, and particularly, I can't remember what page, starting on page 257, that section on secularist versus secular, because I think what he's arguing for is not a secularism that flattens everything out or rules out religion entirely, but one that takes difference and particularity seriously. In some ways, it's a harder kind of secularism, because it means having that difficult conversation that isn't imperialistic, wanting to convert everybody to my point of view, but wants to listen carefully and acknowledge all of our particularities. And I think this is just really well put in the article. So I would recommend. And I think that, so I'll use my analogy. I think interfaith dialogue is like playing a violin. There's not an easy on-ramp. It's difficult work. It should be difficult.
So we have Ryan, we have Dajiku, and we have Irina.
I want to grab onto John's metaphor of the spreading the seeds. I said this to you earlier this week, is that I think in many ways our job is to spread those seeds. Sam and I met at a conference and spoke about some of these items, and sometimes I see our role in campus chaplaincy as overseeing a bed with soil, and we are aware that various people are spreading various seeds, and so we have the difference that exists within the seed, but the integrity of the seed is maintained, right? So the seed is going to sprout up what the seed is going to sprout up.
But sometimes you have to remove the thorns,
Yeah, and there will be thorns
without removing
and weeds.
weeds, right?
And so, as we are stewards of those beds, if you will, those beds still exist within a context of particular theological streams, or, forgive the word theological, sometimes spiritual, traditional environments. What's the, I guess, in the from 2018 forward, what's the unique contribution that a Jesuit school or a Congregationalist school, these schools who started in various streams of thought, how are they uniquely stewarding those beds? Are we coming to a place where we should, that higher education, pushing those over more to an academic space is more helpful? I don't know if I'm being coherent here.
I think you are being coherent. I mean, I'll just speak very, very quickly, because I want to use an example, and it's probably not a helpful example. My example. If I had not gone to the University of Edinburgh and University of Oxford, I would not have gotten the job, because there are people who had applied to get the job that I have who came from the Hindu University of America, who have doctorates, and who applied to become the Hindu chaplain at Georgetown, and they said no to them, and they said yes to me, specifically because I had training from Oxford and Edinburgh. Forget Oxford and what Oxford represents, but Edinburgh specifically, because that's where my doctorate comes from. Edinburgh is unabashedly secularist, not just secular. And even there, I was able to come up with this. So until we kind of address that balance and how that works, stewarding the bed is going to be a little bit more difficult in terms of university education, because we're all not playing on the same bed. We have like these terraces that we're playing on.
I appreciate your inability to provide a concise answer is very important.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Okay, we have Dr.
I was really struck by the kind of coincidence or the coming together of no easy on-ramp, being present as a person of faith, meeting nuns where they are, and the importance of presence as a person of faith, and that in itself is a seed. You know, when you're there, that you're visible.
Yes.
You're there. You're witnessing. Yes, you are a seed, and so I'm kind of curious about how, and that if you meet a nun where they are, but you're unapologetically saying you have to practice the violin. I'm curious about how each of you manage that, or what you actually concretely do with people.
Violin was the example.
I know. I think I'm not sure if I have a good answer, but I'll take an attempt. I think that I try to be clear about my identity, even as that's evolving and growing. When I talk to Muslim students, I'm very clear with them, and they understand that I'm not Muslim and I'm not likely to become one. I'm coming as an ordained Christian minister. But the openness to the conversation I hope says something about what kind of Christian minister I am. So, and I think the temptation, and I think this is the temptation that I think we all probably struggle with, but to oversimplify things. And so I want to complexify things, if that's a word. I don't know.
Yeah.
And to sort of trouble some assumptions. And so that's, I mean, I think, I'm not sure if I can, by tomorrow I might think of a specific example of doing that, but that's I think where my mind is going.
Taking off what Tim said, I'm very happy to sit there and go through with them all of the complexities of my own life, and I'm happy to talk to them about, for example, how Planck's constant helps me understand the power of mantras, how quantum physics was what brought me back towards the kind of path that I'm on, and then by the same token, those who are already part of the faithful lot, I will tell them exactly the seed example is my example always, that seeds cannot deal with water every single day. Seeds need watering once in a while. And so if you can't turn up for our weekly service every single week, don't feel guilty. Don't feel that anybody's looking down on you. You come as and when you can. And I think that kind of openness that Tim was speaking about is, I think, the way that we do it.
Can I make a contribution?
Yeah, please.
My conversations with nuns, but also with people from any religious or spiritual background, I like to say to them, because this is what I do understand my day job to be, my job isn't to help you turn into me. My job is to help you become you, whatever that means, and whatever has real integrity for you. So I'm here to be your conversation partner. I hope that I can ask the right questions, not hate for the right answers, but ask you the right questions that help you do the thinking that leads you into your own maturity of understanding how you're doing your own meaning making, where your values and beliefs lie. They don't have to be anything like mine. But if you want a conversation partner to bounce your thinking off of, I'm really honored to be that for you.
And taking that
as a person of faith.
Yes, taking that position doesn't mean I lack convictions or I'm just neutral, but you're taking the role of a teacher.
Okay, now Irina is waiting for such a long
Well,
time,
that's
so
okay.
it's your turn.
Thank you. I appreciate this. Since I'm kind of not exactly part of this conference, but I did want to say something that really strikes as someone who's coming from the former Soviet Union, and yesterday we had an amazing meeting with the representative of the Israeli government. There's a concept, and I wanted to specifically reflect on what you're saying, Brahmachari, that is a huge concern, and I totally agree. And that is, there's a psychological concept, it's called optimal frustration, and kind of what Alyssa was saying, so I'm kind of reflecting on that as well. And it was the most difficult, torturous situation that the Soviet government used on people, and that is to basically ignore people's outcries, existence, and when they couldn't solve the issue between, let's say, in this case, they were saying Christians or Hindus, just go ahead and do away with it all. And that's the challenge in the field of academia that's uprising in the United States, and that is a huge concern, that we're not actually battling the differences, but the indifference. And so I just wanted to say that it's a good thing to keep an eye on that and be self-aware of that. So thank you.
Wayne, it's yours.
Yeah, this has really been interesting. No one being around me very long would have any question that I have certain viewpoints, and I'm happy to have them over a long period of time of development, reasons for what I do. But in teaching, I found it so important to challenge the student that you need to figure out where you are in your thinking and why you get there. Not just to have heard something, but you have also come to that conviction through a process that gives it validity. At the same time, I said, I want you to develop where you are, but please have humility. Because that's what's lacking. When I hear people saying, and Lisa made a good point of this, when I hear people say that I know in the secular world, well, we are the people who really have knowledge because we don't have viewpoints, that we just listen to everything neutrally, is an absolute nonsense. Mm-hmm. And when you listen to them, they are so ignorant of their own perspective. If you don't know that you have values and biases, and I don't use that in a bad sense, then you're really not learned as you should be. But what I view is that what you do is you say, I recognize where I am because of where I got there. Now, can I set that aside for us to talk, listen, and learn? And then you may take up your same views and go your merry way, but you also allow yourself to grow by somewhat altering where you were. And that's what I see education being, not being valueless and somehow neutral, but by having come to where you are and now let me listen again. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's what I view education to be.
But if you ask a student to practice humility, it's very difficult if you don't do it yourself.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Meaning you have to be humble yourself and accept what the student thinks.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And listen to it.
And I'm in agreeing with that, and that's why I say, there have been many times I've changed my mind, and it's because I say, okay, let me step back. I thought I had it together. Let me step back. Let's talk.
Oh.
And then after you say, well, I've had students, I said, my goodness, I had never thought about that. I agree with you. And at that point, it's learning and growing. You should emulate what you talk about.
So one more question.
Okay.
To Alison, I'm really struck by the story of the two Jewish professors, because I sit in Bar Ilan, I hear the same talk, and I think it is. It's a matter, I think, of what they want is the student to be focused in one thing, and not divert their attention to other areas. And I think I want to ask you if you handle the challenge of the integration, because this cannot be done only with talking to a person. To really make a person understand that if he goes explore his spirituality, his religion, his whatever, in a way you call it, his ability to listen. He does not lose focus in what he really has to success, because we are really achievement-driven. University is driven by achievement, by excellence, by being the best, and you don't have time. You cannot spare the attention to other areas unless it's integrated in what you are doing. So, do you have any handle on that? How you do that?
Yeah, one of the things I think, one of the things I know I'm trying to do is to help faculty or others in this instance who are worried about sort of the contributions of faith or, religious, spiritual perspectives from people's academic work, to understand that, to your point just now, these aren't distractions. Oftentimes they are ways of thinking. Campbell Smith used to say ways of seeing and feeling the world. Describe that as religious ways of being. These are things that really, really can sharpen our intellectual critique and investigation of our academic subjects, whether it's physics or French literature. These are ways of thinking and seeing reality we bring. Don't make us dumb. They actually add a deeper dimension of the way we interrogate whatever is the material before us. And this, please pardon my cat, who's ready to join the conference behind me right now. So I try to make it seem like a much more valuable addition to a critical way of thinking, rather than a distraction or, worst of all, something that dumbs us down.
And you manage to get it across. The message gets across. People get it.
There are two ways of doing this. One, I hope, is modeling it every day, just as a person of faith who's also an intellectual. And the second thing is just having conversations. That's a hard thing to do. You have to have somebody willing to be your conversation partner. But I think the fellow chaplains in the room there might understand that we are hucksters all the time. I like to say that the currency of what we do is human relationships. So it is becoming in relationship with as many people as possible to have these kinds of conversations.
Any questions? We have some more minutes left, so go ahead. We have
5 minutes.
5
We want to
minutes.
set up for the next.
Okay, so a few minutes, at least 5. Tim.
A story just popped into my mind that I think I told someone in the last however long we've been here. I can't even remember, but it says something. I'm not sure what's prompting this, except I think that by entering into dialogue with each other in an interfaith context, we learn something about our own thinking and our own interpretation. A number of years ago, I invited our campus rabbi to speak in our chapel, and on along the walls between these wonderful stained glass windows are banners. And one of the banners is a quotation from the Apostle Paul that says, "In Christ there is neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek." And I had always viewed that as an expression of inclusivity. Isn't that nice? Our differences are sort of washed away. So the rabbi came on a Sunday morning, and he took up that statement, and he said, that writes me out of history. It erases my identity.
There is no means there is none. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. And so to me that was a moment of learning that I needed to hear that from him to understand how that. Now, there could be a long conversation about what that text really means and what is, but it was just an illuminating moment for me to say what I take for granted and rather facilely assume isn't the way other people are interpreting and what they're hearing. And so it's one of the reasons I think the interfaith dialogue is important. It makes us understand the complexities in a way that we might not.
Daniel,
I just
want to make a
This was all
conclusion?
really resonant for me. It brought me back to my days as a student, where I'm sure all of you had similar experience negotiating a secular. Those of you who were on secular campuses, negotiating your how that felt as a religious student. I would just bring back something that Alison said about secular not being neutral. On the other hand, and maybe this is something that he gets into in the article, I haven't had a chance to read it, the secular also does provide something neutral in the sense that when I was a minority student on a college campus in the United States, I felt that gave a baseline of safety, and that at least I didn't have to justify myself vis-a-vis the majority Christian assumptions that many of my students shared. And now, being in a Jewish university, I felt that was reversed, and that I felt that the secular context of even a religious university like Vrajvihari forced me as the majority to be extra sensitive to the Muslim students in my class and not superimpose certain values on the discussion that we were having. So I wondered if that resonates with you, and if you could comment further on whether you see that secularism as neutral in at least that sense.
It was a little hard to hear from where you're sitting. Could you repeat your last sentence?
Sure. That the secular provides a neutral context, at least insofar as those students who are of the minority religion don't have to feel that they have to justify themselves regarding what is the majority religion. Or that they can feel that it creates a safe space for
That's
minority
interesting.
religions.
I was just going to say, I hear you talking about secularism as possibly creating safe space for people who are other in religious ways. Pardon my cat, sorry. very friendly guy. Yeah, that's an interesting way to be thinking about it. Did you feel that, I mean, so secular is safe. For someone who is religious is an interesting way to think about that, because the experience I've had is that secular is used as judgment for people of any particular faith. Would you say that, I mean, I am not opposed to the secularity of the institution I serve, and I understand it really well. Perhaps there's a way that the secular space that's created, thought space, need space, can be combined with a way of creating even safer space for those students who are religious minorities on our campus. There might be a way that the religious minority students would see that as natural in a way that the secular students and faculty would see that as maybe doubly abnormal. But that would be a really interesting conversation to try to promote to me.
Actually, now the hands are popping up, but actually we have to close this discussion, unfortunately. This is a very interesting point that raised now in the very end, which would be another discussion worthwhile, but we have to stop right here.
Take it to coffee.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we're going to take 5 minutes to set up, and then we're going to continue with our next session. And I'm going to start with the handouts. Please take advantage of coffee and.
Thank you for having us. Use it right.
Tim.
Bye, Alison.
Bye,
Alison.
America.
Tim,